We demystify what goes on behind the therapy room door. Join us on this voyage of discovery and co-creative conversations. This is the Therapy Show, Behind Closed Doors podcast, with Bob Cooke and Jacci Jones.
Welcome back to the next episode of the Therapy Show Behind Closed Doors with the wonderful Mr. Bob Cooke and myself, Jacci Jones. And what we're going to be talking about this time is jumping out of the toolbox into the unknown. And we're on episode 199, Bob.
Oh, one more to go.
One more to go. And then we've 200. We've done a double sanctuary.
Over 4 years.
Well, yeah, it will be, won't it?
Oh.
Yeah, 52 weeks in a year. Well, we're getting up to that length of time.
Yeah.
Not a lot of podcasts run that long, you know.
No, nowhere near that long.
Yeah.
Sort of pioneers.
Yeah, well, you come up with all the good titles, Bob. I'm just your sidekick.
No, more than that. But this title's interesting. But I was just looking at myself. I mean, people on podcasts won't be able to look at me unless they go on to go on to my YouTube
channel. Yeah.
But I have got a new jumper on, and
Very
it's
smart.
blue, and it makes me look very nautical.
Do you know, it does. You always look like a sailor. I don't know why. I think it's the beard and everything. You do remind me of a sailor.
Yeah, and the blue suits me. So I didn't dress up necessarily for this podcast, but this is a very warm jumper, and it's very cold.
Yeah. The weather doesn't know what it's doing. It's hot one day and then cold the next day.
That's right. Okay, let's get on to the podcast. So I do a lot of supervision.
Yes.
I've trained many trainees, and I've given supervision a lot over the last 38 years to people just starting out as therapists, people who've been around a long time, and various things. What often happens with therapists, they sort of, how can I express? They create a toolbox often of techniques to work at different stages of maybe treatment planning or with different types of clients. So they have techniques like two-chair techniques, decontamination techniques, visualizations, meditations, permissions, all sorts of techniques which they've learned, which are very good and very appropriate and help people a lot in terms of moving on and healing. So that's fine. And they have a sort of, often supervisees or therapists talk about having a toolbox of different techniques. So when I thought of this title, I thought, yes, let's talk about what happens when people either have gone through all the techniques or they close the toolbox and actually just concentrate on the relationship.
Yeah. Because
the problem with toolboxes and techniques and all these different things is that they're okay if they're used within the relationship between the therapist and client, but if they're used sort of like foisting onto the therapeutic relationship, I think they can be counterproductive. And I often think it's useful to concentrate on what's happening in the relationship more than foisting a technique.
Yeah.
So that's what made me think of the title of this podcast. And
I think a lot of it comes with experience as well, though. I know if you'd have said that to me when I'd first qualified, that would have really freaked me out because I needed the structure around for me to feel safe in the therapy room.
Yeah, I've just today last night, gave some supervision for somebody who was just starting out with their first client.
Yeah.
And the supervision was about their anxieties and fears, but also providing a structure and
Yes.
Thinking about contracts and goals.
Oh.
So I agree with you developmentally that the younger the therapist is, if you like, the more they like structure, techniques. And just like you've just said there, probably get a bit apprehensive.
Yeah.
If they haven't got a structure or a set of techniques to fall back on. So, for example, this person said, what was one of your fears about starting with a client? And she said, "Oh, that I might run out of things to say."
Yeah,
Uh,
as if it's our responsibility that we've got to say something.
yeah,
Yes, yeah,
and they're very common things that people have when you're starting off with clients for the first time. However, even experienced therapists like to have a tool bag of techniques that they can have for working. And I'm not saying those aren't useful things. I just wanted to pose the idea a little bit. If
yeah.
you, if you just for a moment close the toolbox, or you concentrated on the relationship and perhaps reflected on using intuition, or perhaps creative processes that come from within the relationship, how fluid that might be, rather than foisting techniques onto the therapeutic relationship, especially the use of intuition, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, you've been a therapist a long time, Jackie, so when you were seeing clients, I know you like techniques and toolboxes and all those things, and I'm not saying they're not very, very, very useful and important, but maybe, intuition is something. I don't know whether you relied on intuition much or you didn't.
I think I did, more recently before I finished working. Do you know what I mean? Certainly not for the first 4 or 5 years, maybe even. I did rely on having a toolbox of things that I could do. But again, I know I've spoke about it in the past, but I think I took on a lot of the responsibility for what happened in the therapy room. It was my job to to make sure that everything was okay and things flowed and yada yada, rather than, like you said, working on the relationship and being creative and spontaneous and using intuition and all those things. Yeah,
Yes, maybe there's something about a developmental aspect to this, which
absolutely.
you started off right at the beginning.
I can
Yes,
remember being envious of other therapists within the institute that seemed to have I want to say a nonchalant attitude
mm,
to seeing clients. The preparation for me on the run up to seeing a client was all consuming. Do you know what I mean? I wouldn't just turn up 10 minutes before a session. I would make sure I was there a good half an hour before and that I'd sorted the room out and everything was okay. But I think that was for my safety and security. It was nothing to do with the client. It was more about me.
yeah, I know a lot of therapists who follow your way of being. By the way, I don't think you're abnormal in that way at all, and also it's part of your personality as well.
Yeah, yeah. But I was envious of those therapists that virtually turned up at the same time as the clients and just hit the ground running with whatever the client brought on that particular day. Very
Mm.
envious of them. Yeah.
And maybe that does come with experience. Yeah, I like what you said at the beginning. Um, I also teach the methods of psychotherapy, coming from Erskine's methods, where they're inquiry, uh, attunement, and involvement are the major methods of an integrative psychotherapy. And let's just take the top one, which is inquiry.
Yeah.
Asking open questions, inquiring about how the past affects the present. I don't particularly think that's a technique. I think that's often a way of being in a relationship. And I think that to use um, transactional dialogue of open questions and tell me a little bit more about that, and inquiring and being curious in a relationship is more in the relationship rather than coming from a toolbox.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Now, I would say if somebody asked me, and they do ask me, Jackie, so it's not if somebody, they say, what sort of tips would you give after such a long time in psychotherapy and that your career? One of the top tips actually is daring to be curious in the relationship. curious about how come a person comes from that frame of reference, or how come they think that way, or how come those connections were that way, or
Yeah.
whichever way. And that comes from me. I've always been very, very curious. Not anyway in my toolbox or a technique that I bring out. I've always used curiosity. I've always wanted to know the narrative and the person's story and how they become the way they are and their reflections and how do they think they can change. And I've
It's
always,
a really valuable thing to have, that is to have that curiosity and that inquiry, because two people can have gone through, pretty much the same thing, but feel completely different about it or react or respond completely differently. So
mm,
it's necessary for us to have that
mm, mm,
inquiry and to ask the questions rather than making assumptions. I know we've spoke about that in past podcasts.
mm. And daring to be curious and daring to use your own creativity. I don't think the techniques from a toolbox. Techniques from a toolbox are just things as, maybe sand tray, maybe two chair technique, maybe using art therapy, maybe many different things from CBT, many, things I could talk about which people might bring out when they're working with certain people. And fine, there's nothing wrong with that. But what I'm talking about, the natural qualities that you've got yourself,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
daring to use them.
Yes.
And what I see with beginning therapists, particularly, and again, you might be absolutely right from the beginning, where you say it's a matter of experience, and right at the beginning, people need structures and everything else. And I know that's true. I'm always struck by beginning therapists who almost inhibit their natural qualities,
Yeah.
because they think
Like
they should,
sterilize themselves or
yeah,
whatever.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
because they think they should be doing things a certain way.
Yeah. Because I think it's a really important point that you've brought up there, Bob, because we are a tool in the therapy room.
Mm.
Our upbringing, our experiences, us as a person, we are actually a tool to be used in that environment. Absolutely.
Yeah, to do that from a natural place is,
Yeah.
I think, a wonderful resource.
Yeah.
And beginning therapists, particularly, but therapists per se, often inhibit using their natural qualities. Humor is another one.
Yes.
Like,
Yeah.
and I'm doing supervision with this very bubbly supervisor, and when I listen to a tape of her in the session, I don't hear any of that humor, that sense of excitement, that bubbly personality. It's like that disappears. So when I say I'm, Joan, whoever it is, I think I'm listening to a different person than from the person I'm talking to in the room, because in the room, you seem to have a great sense of freedom, free child, if you want to use that language, which I don't see or hear in the therapy room. And then, of course, often comes back some sort of response. Oh, I didn't know I could just be myself in the room.
I was going to say that. I was thinking again, but it's preconceived ideas and preconceived conceptions that when you're talking about having a sense of humor in the therapy room, people think, well, is that allowed? Are we, it's a very serious matter that we're doing. Should we even think about having a sense of humor as a therapist?
Well, again, you're correct. I think, especially for beginning therapists, but even therapists are expensive. My response back to that is, um, if there's no light in the intense darkness, sometimes people find it hard to breathe.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think again, it's about having the skill to know when and where that sense of humour can be used within the therapy room and when it's appropriate and when it's not appropriate. But it does show that human side to us, I think.
Mm,
I questioned everything when I first started seeing clients, the clothes that I wore, how I sat, do you know what I mean? The words I used, all sorts of things. I really thought I needed to change who I was as a person in order to be a good therapist. And it's just not true.
Certainly not true, and you're not out of the norm there. I think if I went round the 60 odd trainees we had, I think a majority of them would answer the way you've just answered.
Yeah.
And a supervisor's job, in a way, is to counteract that viewpoint, because that viewpoint leads to, I think, a different type of therapy, a therapy which is fabricated, manufactured
Yeah.
way,
Yeah.
rather, rather than from a genuine human relational framework.
Yeah. Which again is, why I think it's so important. One like podcasts like this, where we expose what goes on behind the therapy room door, because you don't know that, but to have peer support and, to be around other therapists and have a role model, somebody that you look up to, that you want to be like or whatever, and not necessarily mold yourself on that, but have permission to allow parts of yourself in that room.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And one of the vital concepts which is taught throughout all the trainings that I ever know, counselling trainings, psychotherapy trainings, is the use of modeling.
Yes, yeah,
So therapists model the healthy behaviors they're actually promoting with their work with their clients. And I think to model appropriately, I mean appropriately, I don't mean, from a sort of unacceptable way or something, appropriately to model free child energy, to model humor in the right, mode, to model that sort of, I said bubbliness, but I mean that sort of enthusiastic energy.
yes, yeah,
Important.
yeah, absolutely. Because there does need to be times, like you said, of lightness in the therapy room. Yeah. When you're being a supervisor,
Mm.
do you think you're also modeling being a therapist to the supervisee? Does that
What
make sense?
makes absolutely complete sense. Just like the therapist is modeling to the client, the
Yeah,
supervisor is modeling to the supervisee stroke therapist. And it's a very important process.
yeah,
So you will not find a supervision session with me, for example, without me being me. And what I mean by that is my natural attributes of curiosity, humor, um, energetic expression. If you,
yeah,
that's part of my intrinsic personality. And you see, I think that, so yes, the answer to your question is yes, definitely. So hopefully supervisees can take some of that modeling back to their clients, which is so vital.
yeah,
I think if the therapist isn't themselves in a therapy room, you've got the opposite of a relational psychotherapy.
yes, yeah,
I think it's extraordinarily important for a supervisor to model these intrinsic qualities and, in fact, talk about that and how to do that, but certainly to model it.
yeah. I think I got an awful lot from group supervision because I was also hearing how there was three of us in my supervision when I had it, and I got an awful lot from listening to the other ones who I was also in training with and how they were with the clients. And again, I, I don't know whether give me permission is the right way of saying it, but it opened the doors for me to look at alternative ways that I could be within the therapy room.
Yeah, there's a word for that, vicarious learning.
Yeah, absolutely. It did. It worked for me. I was in group therapy and I also had group supervision, and I did get an awful lot from that. Yeah,
Vicarious learning,
yeah,
very
absolutely.
important part of group psych. It's a very important part of group supervision and group psychotherapy, by the way.
Yeah. And transactional analysis originally was meant to be in
Well,
groups, wasn't
it
it?
started its life as a group psychotherapy.
Yeah,
Eric Byrne, the inventor of transaction analysis, if you want to, or the founder of transaction analysis, who created the model parent adult child, he was a psychiatrist and psychotherapist working with very disturbed people, extreme personality disorders, in Carmel Hospital, just outside San Francisco. And he ran group sessions with very disturbed people and used his new model of transaction analysis, parent, adult, child, with these very disturbed people and help them stay in the here and now
Mm,
rather than going down into the past. And he used his transaction analysis model in a group setting for that process. And I would say, and he's not here, and it's 70 years ago, but if I talk to Eric now, looking up into the stars, I would say one of the most important learnings probably for all the patients was a vicarious learning,
yeah,
where they learned from the group dynamic and the group people around.
yeah. I don't think it's used enough in this country, actually.
Well, group psychotherapy.
Yeah, I think people think it needs to be on its own, it's private, and do you know what I mean? But yeah, I mine was invaluable. Absolutely.
I think group supervision, group psychotherapy particularly has gone out of favor, I think, in this country.
Yeah.
I only know about in where I live, which is Greater Manchester. I probably only even know about two or three people in my sort of orbit, which run groups.
Yeah. Which is a shame.
Oh, it's a drastic loss to the TA community and psychotherapy community as a whole. I'm a
Yeah.
great advocate uh, and running groups for a very long time.
Because we do get so much support from being in a group and that sense of belonging and there's I can't even say it, a plethora of things that you get from being within a group therapeutically anywhere.
Oh, anyway, no,
Yeah.
I'm a great believer, and I don't know why group psychotherapy seems to have gone out of flavor in the United Kingdom. I have no idea. I know I ran 5 psychotherapy groups a week in my height of being a group
I couldn't
psychotherapist.
believe it. Yeah.
And there's 8 to a group, so there's 5. That's 40 patients.
Yeah. And it's not just a practical thing. Do you know what I mean? I suppose as therapist, you've only got so many hours that you can work. So if you can work with a group,
Mm.
then do you know what I mean? You're getting to see more clients or whatever. It's not just from a practical point of view. It's the benefits of being part of a group for the client. Yeah.
I really agree. And if we talk about techniques and toolboxes and all that, as a group psychotherapist, my toolbox, if you want to put it that way, got bigger and bigger.
Mm.
However, I would say, I would honestly say that when the energy was more fluid and the healing was at its optimum, it was from a relational perspective
Yeah.
with me using my attributes of spontaneity, creativity, curiosity um, in a relational process. Even though I could call on many techniques, Jackie, I
Yes.
really
Yeah.
could.
Yeah.
Yeah. The ones I would value most aren't techniques, they're human attributes.
Yeah.
I don't want anybody listening to this thinking or that I'm putting down techniques. I'm not, because they promote great processes, if you like, and help people get into their child ego state and different parts of the past. I just want to put a positive check against human attributes rather than people relying perhaps on techniques, etc. I
Yeah.
think there's a space for both.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, continuous professional development and everything and
Oh yeah.
learning new things is really, really important. But as you say, to put our own slant on it or to put our own personality and, those is really important.
Otherwise, we become robots, don't we?
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's what I was doing in the early days after I was working in the institute in the low cost. I look back on it very fondly now, but I do think, oh my God, Jackie, what were you doing
Yeah, yeah.
when I
Well,
first started seeing clients?
I believe there's a developmental aspect to this. I think you're perfectly right about this. That the more experienced you are, the more you're able to allow yourself to be yourself, I hope.
Yes,
But I have supervised very, very experienced psychotherapists who find it challenging to, close their toolbox, if you want to put it that way, and allow themselves to just rely more on their relational attributes. So it's an interesting one. I certainly think that, well, you know what I think. We've talked about artificial intelligence in other podcasts,
yeah,
but we're starting in the robotic era. I would hate psychotherapy to go the way of, a hologram or a robot or an AI algorithm rather,
absolutely.
rather than a relational human process.
Yeah. Even more reason to bring back group therapy.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I worry about the loss of people allowing themselves as therapists to use their own human attributes, especially in the world where we're going with algorithms and constant formulas and treatment plans and digital treatment plans. I could go on and on.
I think that's it. Doing the Zoom, I said I would never work online because I felt like you didn't get that connection. But then COVID came and everybody worked online. So I was working online. But you can get therapy via text now. How does a relationship work in that situation? How do you bring yourself into
No,
a
no,
text?
no,
It can't be done.
no. I'm a huge believer in face-to-face therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too.
Where we have a personality in front of them. I mean, I do a lot of Zoom supervision, which I think is a bit more different because it's an adult process.
Transactions, yeah.
But when you're actually working towards the child ego state, I think, you know, something hugely lost online.
I feel the same. Yeah. I said I would never do it, but then COVID happened and it was like, well, do I not see the clients now? And is that going to be more detrimental and harmful to them rather than doing it online via Zoom? So,
Mm.
yeah.
I have a huge, extensive toolbox, and I'm not arguing this podcast or even discussing the podcast, getting rid of your toolbox of experience. I am giving a plea to people listening or watching to allow themselves to take the risk to be themselves with clinical thought, of course.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And it would be interesting to hear what any of the listeners think about that, if they wanted to comment on the podcast about how often they feel that they do allow their individuality and creativity to be used within the therapy room, or are they more reliant on the techniques?
Mm. I think so. I think it's would be great to hear from people.
Yeah,
And thank you for allowing me to talk about this because as the podcast's gone on, I've come even more um, engrossed with the idea of um, giving permission to therapists to be themselves,
yeah.
to allow their individuality to come out.
I think you modeled that superbly in the institute.
I hope so.
Absolutely, yeah. I was thinking as you were saying that, then how do you put that into training? How do you train somebody to use their own uniqueness? It's very difficult.
Very difficult because people are attempting to be the type of therapist they think their trainers and supervisors want to be,
Yeah,
or the books want them to be.
yeah,
And I don't know how many books are actually written about allowing or promoting the beginning therapists to actually use their individual selves and their humor and their spontaneity and the energy It's more rather turn to page 36 on this book and TA today and follow this formula.
Yeah. And I think that's why I said that you modelled it perfectly on the training weekends, where, whenever you were there, we knew that it was you that was doing the training by your uniqueness. Yeah.
I've always promoted individuality, but with clinical thought.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So, Bob, another wonderful podcast.
Yeah, and the next one is going to be our 200th, Jacci Jones.
It's going to be our 200th one, and it is a really good one. Is there a minimum or maximum time limit for therapists to consider when working with clients?
Well, that's a wonderful podcast. I look forward to that.
Yeah. So until next time, Bob, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to The Therapy Show, Behind Closed Doors podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. We'll be back next week with another episode.